Jason's quiet suburban life was shattered when the HOA's enforcers viciously rammed his wife Emily's car, accusing her of some petty rule violation. Led by the smug Ted Marlowe, the HOA officers reveled in their power, disregarding Emily's dignity and the law itself. But Emily had a secret weapon, her past as a Navy SEAL commander, and she wasn't going down without a fight. But just wait until you see how the tables turned and how Emily's unexpected move brought the whole tyrannical regime crashing down. Part 1. The Unthinkable Shocks. Jason Blackwell had spent years crafting a quiet, peaceful life in the safe suburban enclave of Cedar Ridge. His mornings were predictable, filled with the soft hum of neighborhood tranquility and the occasional clink of a neighbor's mailbox closing. It was the kind of life where the biggest worry was whether the lawn was mowed in time for the weekend barbecue. But that morning, as his wife Emily left for a quick errand, everything, the life he thought he knew, shattered in an instant. Jason had no idea what was waiting for Emily just outside their driveway. He was at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside broke the silence. It wasn't the usual hum of a neighbor's car. This was different. A heavy, grating sound, followed by a sharp, sickening thud. Jason stood up, his heart already starting to race. A massive truck, black with the emblem of the HOA stamped across its side, had plowed into Emily's car with terrifying force. The front bumper crumpled under the impact, the sound of metal screeching and bending louder than anything Jason had ever heard. The car rolled sideways, finally crashing to a halt against the curb, its frame twisted like a broken doll. His chest tightened. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, none of them making sense. Why? Why would anyone do this? Rushing to the front door, Jason's eyes fixed on Emily's vehicle. He could see her inside. Thankfully, she was still moving, albeit in a daze. The force of the collision had rattled her, but she was alive. That was the only thing that mattered at that moment. Then he saw them. The men in uniforms. Not police officers, not emergency responders. No, these were the HOA's so-called neighborhood patrol officers. The ones who had been creeping around Cedar Ridge for weeks, breathing down people's necks over trivial rules. The kind of people who looked for anything to use against you. The kind who seemed to believe they had power over every little detail of your life. But this was beyond petty violations of HOA rules. This wasn't about a lawn that was 2 inches too high or a mailbox that was slightly crooked. This was violence, unprovoked, unjustified, and it was aimed directly at Emily. The man leading the charge, Ted Marlowe, strode toward Emily's car with an expression that oozed superiority, as though this was just another routine stop. He looked down at Emily with disdain, as if her life, her pain, were nothing more than an afterthought. "You've violated several neighborhood regulations," he declared, his voice dripping with smug authority. "And you're not above the rules, Mrs. Blackwell." Jason clenched his fists, his mind scrambling to process the absurdity of it all. Emily wasn't just some ordinary housewife. They all knew that. She wasn't the type to let some self-righteous HOA enforcer push her around. She was calm, composed, and fiercely protective of her family. But now they'd crossed a line. Jason felt the anger rising inside him, bubbling up like hot lava. His mind was flooded with a rush of thoughts. What gives these people the right? What makes them think they can do this? He took a step forward, ready to demand an explanation, when he heard Emily's voice. "Jason, stay back." Her voice was steady, too steady. The same calm, measured tone she always used when things got dangerous, when it was time to take control. Jason froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what she was about to do, but he could feel the tension in the air. This was no longer a simple neighborhood dispute. This was something much darker. The thing was, Emily wasn't just any woman. She had spent years as a Navy SEAL commander. Jason knew this, of course, but she never talked about it. The medals, the training, the dark side of her past, it was all locked away, buried deep beneath layers of quiet suburban life. She had left that world behind, choosing instead a life of peace, away from the chaos of her former career. But now that past might just come crashing back into their lives. Jason had no idea how far her training would go in this moment, how deep her military instincts ran, how much of that quiet, deadly calm she had learned as a leader of elite soldiers could be triggered by a single moment of crisis. And how far would these so-called enforcers push? How much were they willing to risk? As he looked at Ted and his gang, Jason knew one thing for certain. The situation was far from over, and it would only get worse from here. Jason's heart raced as he sprinted down the driveway, each step carrying the weight of dread and fury. His mind was a blur, but one thing was crystal clear. The people who had done this to Emily were not just bullies. They were monsters in disguise. As he reached the street, he saw Emily standing still, her hands shaking only slightly, but the shock on her face was undeniable. She was unharmed, thankfully, but her car, the one thing she had meticulously kept in perfect condition, was ruined. The front bumper was barely recognizable, the side panels crushed as though they had been made of paper. The wheels, no longer round, sprawled awkwardly against the curb. But it wasn't just the car that was broken. Jason could see the subtle shift in her posture, the tense line of her shoulders that hinted at the boiling rage beneath her composed exterior. And then there were them. The HOA enforcers, a gang of self-appointed tyrants in uniforms too absurd for their own good, stood nearby, laughing like schoolyard bullies. Their faces were smug, their bodies puffed with pride, as if they had just conquered some great victory. To them, this was just another win in their endless campaign to control every inch of their neighborhood, every detail of people's lives. Jason could feel the anger tightening in his chest, squeezing his heart with each passing second. He wanted to shout, to charge forward and demand an explanation, but it was Emily who caught his attention. Her eyes, still locked on the wreckage, were not the eyes of a victim. No, they were colder, sharper, like the gleam of a predator sensing its prey. The calmness in her expression wasn't out of shock, but control. She was in charge of this moment. Jason could see it now. This wasn't the Emily he thought he knew. This was the Emily who had led Special Forces missions, who had faced impossible odds with nothing but her grit and willpower. This was the Emily who had put enemies in their place in ways that left no room for doubt. Ted Marlowe, the leader of the HOA's so-called neighborhood patrol, took a few steps toward Emily. His grin was twisted, like a snake that had cornered its prey, relishing every second of his power. He was a middle-aged man, balding and pasty, dressed in a cheap suit that barely hid his unearned sense of superiority. "You think you're above us, don't you?" he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "Nobody gets away with defying the HOA around here. Your perfect little life ends today." The words struck Jason like a slap to the face. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was no longer just about neighborhood rules. It was about domination, about breaking people for the sake of power. The very fabric of their lives had been torn apart by these people, and Jason could feel the rage rising inside him like a tidal wave. His fists clenched involuntarily, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. But as he stood there, frozen with fury, his gaze shifted to Emily once more. Her eyes were no longer filled with shock or disbelief. They were filled with something darker, something colder. The calmness in her demeanor now felt unsettling, as if she were calculating the next move, not reacting to the one that had just happened. She didn't speak immediately, but her stance had changed. Her body, once rigid with tension, now held an eerie stillness, a readiness. Jason realized something then. This was her moment, not his. He wasn't the one who would handle this. The woman standing in front of him, with her hands steady at her sides and her jaw set in a way that was both serene and terrifying, had faced worse than this. The HOA may have thought they had won with their petty stunt, but they had no idea what they were dealing with, and that, Jason knew, would be their downfall. Ted Marlowe took another step toward Emily, his grin widening as he raised a hand as if to push her further. "What are you going to do, huh? Call the cops? The HOA runs this neighborhood." But Emily's voice, when it came, was cold and controlled. "You've made a big mistake, Marlowe." Jason could hear the quiet threat in her words, but it was more than that. It was the calm before the storm, the unsettling silence that only those who had survived real combat would understand. Marlowe smirked, stepping closer, too confident for his own good. "Oh yeah? What are you going to do about it, sweetheart?" Jason felt a flicker of fear run through him. Fear, not for Emily, but for the men who were about to find out just how wrong they were. The growing hatred inside him began to simmer, but he held his ground. Whatever was coming next, whatever storm was about to be unleashed, he knew that Emily would handle it, because she had faced far worse than a gang of petty bureaucrats trying to ruin her life. And for them, this was only the beginning. The laughter of the HOA officers echoed through the street, their smug faces twisted in satisfaction. They had believed they were untouchable, that their petty rules and petty power could bend the world to their will. But then, Emily stepped forward, her movements precise and deliberate, as though each step was calculated for maximum impact. Jason's breath caught in his chest as he watched her. The woman he had married, the woman he had known as the kind-hearted mother and the dedicated wife, was now a stranger. There was no trace of softness left in her eyes, no hint of vulnerability. Her gaze was locked on Ted Marlowe, the leader of this twisted band of enforcers, and it was chilling. There was something unmistakably cold in her stance, something fierce and unwavering. Without a word, Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't look at Jason, didn't even acknowledge him as she typed something into it with quick, efficient movements. Then she turned to him, her eyes narrowing as she gave a quiet, controlled command. "Stay back, Jason," she said, her voice like a blade slicing through the tension. Jason wanted to argue, wanted to demand an explanation, but the tone in her voice left no room for doubt. He was a spectator now, not the one who could change anything. She was in control. For the first time, he understood just how far her training went. Emily's finger hovered over the phone's screen, and then she pressed send. The change in her demeanor was instantaneous. She stood taller, more resolute, as if the moment she made that call, the air around her grew heavier. And then, the first rumble reached them. It started as a faint tremor in the distance, a low hum that vibrated the very ground beneath their feet. Jason, confused, looked over at Emily. Her expression hadn't changed. She was focused, waiting. Within minutes, the hum turned into a roar as the first convoy of military vehicles appeared at the edge of the neighborhood. A line of black SUVs, armored trucks, and military jeeps rolled into the cul-de-sac, their engines snarling and their tires eating up the pavement. The HOA officers looked on, stunned and speechless. But the real shock came as the doors of the vehicles opened. Out stepped SEALs, dozens of them, dressed in full tactical gear. Their faces were covered by visors, their weapons ready, but their movements disciplined. The sound of boots on concrete filled the street as they began to take positions, surrounding the perimeter of the neighborhood. It was a show of force so sudden, so overwhelming, that it left the entire street in stunned silence. Ted Marlowe and his gang took a step back, their arrogant grins faltering as they realized they were no longer in control. This wasn't a typical confrontation. This was something else entirely. As the last SEALs positioned themselves, the convoy leader, a grizzled commander who had served alongside Emily in countless missions, stepped forward. His eyes locked with hers, and in that brief exchange, Jason saw a level of respect that spoke volumes. These men weren't just following orders. They were here because they trusted Emily, because they knew the kind of leader she was. Emily nodded once, and the SEALs spread out, taking up strategic positions, securing the area. Jason stood frozen, unable to move, watching in awe as the street transformed from a suburban cul-de-sac into a scene of military precision. The HOA officers stood frozen, their faces pale, as if the ground had been ripped out from under them. Ted Marlowe, The man who had been so sure of his own power now looked like a fool. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted from one seal to the next, his bravado melting away like ice in the sun. Jason could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't about the car anymore. It wasn't about the broken rules. It was about something far deeper. It was about respect. The quiet storm inside Emily's chest was now on full display. Jason knew then that this wasn't just a response to their petty power trip. It was her final stand. She had been pushed too far, and now the people who had tried to break her would see exactly what she was made of. Ted Marlowe's voice finally broke through the silence, a weak, trembling demand. "What is this? What do you think you're doing?" Emily's voice was steady, unwavering. "What I should have done a long time ago." She took one step forward, her hand resting on her side, her posture commanding. The SEALs, her team, stayed perfectly still, awaiting her command. Jason looked at her, feeling a deep sense of awe and fear. He had never seen this side of her, never imagined she was capable of wielding this much power. He had always known she was strong, but this was something else entirely. It was clear now. This was not just about the car. It wasn't even about the HOA's abuse. It was about respect. And Emily had been pushed too far to turn back. The confrontation was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The tension in the street was thick. The HOA officers, now clearly outnumbered and outgunned, stood frozen. They had come into this thinking they were untouchable, but now the reality of their situation was setting in. Their power, once so absolute, had crumbled before their eyes. The men who had laughed and jeered moments earlier now exchanged wary glances, their bravado fading. Yet, despite the overwhelming force around them, they refused to back down. Ted Marlowe, still standing with his arms crossed, looked up at Emily with defiance in his eyes. His arrogance hadn't quite vanished, though it was now tinged with uncertainty. Emily walked toward him, her steps measured and deliberate, as if the world itself were moving in slow motion. Her sunglasses, dark and impassive, shielded her eyes, but her posture spoke volumes. With every step, the sense of power and control she exuded only grew stronger. The weight of the moment hung in the air, charged with anticipation. When she was a few feet from him, she stopped. Ted didn't move, didn't flinch. He was still trying to cling to his position, even in the face of the force she had brought to bear. But Emily wasn't intimidated. Not one bit. She slowly took off her sunglasses, folding them with a measured gesture and slipping them into the pocket of her jacket. Her gaze locked onto Ted's with unflinching precision. For a moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. "Do you know who I am, Ted?" Emily's voice was calm, smooth, and cutting. Each word fell with deadly clarity, like the slice of a blade through the air. Ted's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. He was still trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was slipping, fast. "I'm someone," Emily continued, her eyes never leaving his, "who doesn't take lightly to being disrespected." The weight of her words settled over him like a storm cloud, darkening his smug expression. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. It was clear now that Emily was no ordinary woman. She wasn't just a retired SEAL commander. She was a force, a woman who had endured countless trials and had learned the hardest lessons of survival. And today, she would show him what it meant to cross her. Without another word, Emily gave a subtle signal to the SEALs. In an instant, they moved. Their actions were coordinated, flawless, every movement precise and deliberate. They swarmed the HOA truck, securing it in seconds, rendering it useless. Phones were disabled, messages deleted, and the area was locked down tighter than a vault. Ted's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. The HOA enforcers, who had once believed themselves untouchable, were now powerless. It didn't matter that they had tried to impose their petty rules on Emily's life. It didn't matter how loud they had shouted or how many times they had humiliated her. In the blink of an eye, they were now the ones at the mercy of her team. Ted, Ever the stubborn leader attempted to stand his ground, but it was futile. Within moments, the SEALs had him subdued, and he was being handcuffed. His attempts at resistance nothing more than a final show of misplaced pride. As the officers were rounded up and taken into custody, the neighborhood began to stir. The once hostile onlookers, who had watched from their windows with contempt and curiosity, were now witnessing something else. They had underestimated Emily, had dismissed her as just another quiet suburban wife. But now they were seeing the truth, and they were in awe. As Jason stood beside Emily, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This wasn't just about the car or the HOA. This was about something much bigger, about standing up to injustice, about reclaiming dignity, and about reminding the world that no one, not even a group of petty enforcers, could break her spirit. The neighborhood, once filled with suspicion and hostility, began to shift. Whispers of admiration spread like wildfire, and the respect that Emily had earned was undeniable. People who had once quietly tolerated the HOA's oppressive control were now seeing them for what they truly were, bullies with no power against someone like Emily. As Ted and his crew were loaded into police cars, their faces a mixture of disbelief and humiliation, Jason turned to Emily. She stood tall, unshaken, her eyes fixed on the retreating convoy. Her mission was complete, but there was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet, unwavering satisfaction. The HOA was dismantled, their officers scattered, their reign of petty terror brought to a swift and definitive end. The justice system moved in quickly, ensuring that the community would never again suffer under their cruelty. For Emily, this wasn't about revenge. It was about standing her ground, showing that beneath the surface of their quiet suburban life, there was strength and resolve that no one could break. And as Jason watched her, his heart swelled with pride. He had always known she was exceptional. But today, she had reminded the entire neighborhood and the world of just who she was. The woman he loved wasn't just a Navy SEAL commander. She was a warrior, and nothing could ever take that from her.